On the 2nd of July 1945, a small patrol of Gurkha soldiers was pushing through thick jungle in the Pegu Yomas, a range of low, forested mountains in central Burma. The monsoon had turned every trail into a river of mud. Visibility was almost nothing. And somewhere in that green wall of forest, they walked straight into a Japanese detachment. The ambush was quick and total. Every Japanese soldier in the group was killed. But what the Gurkhas found afterward was worth more than any body count. Inside a leather dispatch bag carried by one of the dead men was a complete set of documents. Maps, timetables, orders, unit assignments. Everything the Japanese 28th Army had put together for its last desperate breakout from the mountains. Within hours, those documents were on the desk of the British Corps commander. Within days, every Allied unit across 100 miles of the Sittang Valley knew exactly where the Japanese would cross, exactly when they would try it, and exactly how many were coming. The enemy's entire plan had been handed over, and the British had 2 weeks to get ready. What followed was one of the most devastating, one-sided engagements of the entire Second World War. A whole Japanese field army, 18,000 men, walked into a trap from which barely a third came out alive. It was the last major land battle fought by Western Allied forces in that war, and almost nobody has heard of it. To understand how 18,000 Japanese soldiers ended up starving in a Burmese mountain range in the summer of 1945, you have to go back 3 years, to the worst moment the British Empire ever suffered in Southeast Asia. In December 1941, the Japanese army crossed from Thailand into Burma. The defending force was tiny: 2 understrength British battalions, 2 Indian infantry brigades, and a handful of local Burmese units were all that stood between the Japanese and an entire country. And the Japanese used the tactics that had already shattered Allied armies across Asia: fast infiltration through jungle the British thought impassable, flanking moves through terrain where flanking was supposed to be impossible, and relentless pressure on supply lines already stretched to breaking. The British fell back from one position to the next. Rangoon, the capital and main port, fell in March 1942. The defenders pulled north up the Irrawaddy Valley, hoping to make a stand. They couldn't. Mandalay fell. The oil fields at Yenangyang were set ablaze to keep them out of Japanese hands, and the smoke from those burning wells could be seen 50 miles across the plains. British and Indian troops were pushed all the way back to the Indian border, a retreat of nearly 1,000 miles through monsoon, jungle, and mountains. Thousands of civilians fled with them. Many never made it. The land route from India to China was cut, leaving one dangerous air corridor over the Himalayas, the route the pilots called the Hump. Burma was gone. For the men who survived that retreat, the humiliation sat in their bones. They began calling themselves the Forgotten Army, and for a while the name was simply accurate. Europe consumed everything: North Africa, Sicily, Normandy. Burma barely made the newspapers in London. The men fighting and dying in the jungle felt abandoned, and in a real sense they were. But one man saw a way back. Lieutenant General William Slim took command of the newly formed 14th Army in late 1943, and he inherited a force that was broken in every way that mattered. Morale was gone. Logistics were chaos. Malaria was pulling more men out of the line than the Japanese were, and the troops had lost all confidence that they could fight in the jungle and win. Slim fixed every part of it, from the ground up. He rebuilt the supply chain so frontline troops actually got what they needed. He made malaria prevention a matter of military discipline, not medical advice, because in 1943 more men were being evacuated sick than wounded. He retrained his soldiers to fight in thick jungle, to hold their ground when the enemy got behind them instead of breaking, and to trust air resupply from Dakota transports when the roads were cut. That last point mattered enormously. The Japanese jungle method was encirclement: surround a position, cut the road, and wait for the defenders to run. Slim's answer was simple and merciless: stop running, hold the box, call for air supply, and let the Japanese be the ones who starve. The 14th Army was not really a British army at all. By 1945, it was only about 1 in 8 British by origin. Its backbone was the Indian Army, which grew to over 2 million men, the largest volunteer force in history. There were African divisions, Gurkha battalions from Nepal, and specialist units of every kind. By 1944, this was one of the most formidable fighting forces anywhere on Earth. The army that had been humiliated in 1942 was gone. What replaced it was something the Japanese had never met. The test came in the spring of 1944 when Japan launched its own invasion of India, a drive to smash the frontier at Imphal and Kohima and knock Britain out of the war in Asia. It was one of the most ambitious offensives Japan attempted in the whole war, and it failed completely. Imphal and Kohima became the worst defeat the Imperial Japanese Army had ever suffered. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were lost, most of them to disease and starvation, as their supply lines collapsed behind them. The survivors staggered back into Burma with nothing, and for the first time, the road to reconquest was open. Slim did not waste it. In January 1945, the 14th Army drove into central Burma, and the plan was brilliant. While one corps pushed openly toward Mandalay and fixed the Japanese defenders' attention, another corps slipped south through the hills and crossed the Irrawaddy almost unnoticed. On the 4th of March, they seized Meiktila, the critical supply and communications hub that tied the Japanese northern front to Rangoon. The capture of Meiktila was the masterstroke of the campaign. It cut the Japanese supply lines in half and collapsed their defense across central Burma. Mandalay fell on the 21st of March. The Japanese were in full retreat, and Slim's forces were right behind them. But there was a problem. The monsoon was coming, and if it arrived before Rangoon fell, the whole advance would drown in mud. So Slim drove his men south at a punishing pace, while a separate seaborne force, Operation Dracula, assaulted Rangoon from the coast. On the 2nd of May, the capital fell. The two forces linked up days later, and Burma was, for all practical purposes, retaken. And that is where the story of the Sittang Bend really begins. If you are enjoying this, and you think the Forgotten Army deserves to be a lot less forgotten, take a second right now to hit like and subscribe, because what these men did next is one of the most lopsided victories in the entire war, and it is barely in the history books. When Rangoon fell, the Japanese still had forces scattered across the country. Most were fleeing east, toward Thailand. But one large formation was stuck. The Japanese 28th Army, under Lieutenant General Shozo Sakurai, had fallen back from the Arakan coast and the Irrawaddy Valley, and ended up in the Pegu Yomas, a belt of low, jungle-choked mountains between the Irrawaddy and the Sittang River. They were trapped. The British held the open plains on both sides. The Sittang was swollen by the monsoon and utterly unfordable, and the Pegu Yomas were no place to survive. The hills were smothered in dense jungle. The trails had become streams, and every low patch of ground was underwater. The men hiding in those mountains had almost nothing left. Their rations had run out weeks earlier, and what little they could scavenge in the jungle was barely enough to keep a man on his feet. Medical supplies were gone. Cholera was moving through whole units. Dysentery had drained thousands, to the point where a single day's march left them unable to rise the next morning. Wounds went untreated. The rain never stopped. Sakurai had roughly 18,000 men under his direct command, including the 54th and 55th Divisions, once powerful formations, now shadows of themselves, along with a mixed brigade of anti-aircraft gunners, airfield laborers, and naval personnel several thousand strong, and a small naval guard force. But the real fighting strength of those 18,000 was a fraction of the number. Many could barely walk. Some had to be carried. And worse still, the Burmese National Army, under Aung San, had switched sides. The very forces that had marched with Japan against the British in 1942 were now hunting Japanese patrols and foraging parties through the hills. There was no safe ground left anywhere. General Haitaro Kimura, commanding the Japanese Burma Area Army, ordered a breakout. The 28th Army would push east, out of the Pegu Yomas, cross the Sittang, and link up with the remaining Japanese forces beyond it. To cover the move, a diversionary attack would strike British positions down near the Sittang Bend, the sharp curve in the river near its mouth, to pull Allied attention south and away from the real crossing points. On paper, the plan looked reasonable. It had one fatal flaw. The British already knew a breakout was coming. Their intelligence had picked up enough to grasp the outline. What they lacked were the specifics. So the British 12th Army, under General Montague Stopford, had spread the corps under Frank Messervy across more than 100 miles of the Sittang Valley, told to watch everything and wait. Then the Gurkhas found that dispatch bag, and everything changed. The captured papers held the complete operational plan: crossing points, column assignments, timings, unit dispositions. The British now knew Sakurai intended to advance in 3 columns. They knew his men had been ordered to use only bayonets, no firearms. They knew the Japanese had been told to use no radios at all once they left the Pegu Yomas, and they knew the crossing would depend on rafts lashed together from bamboo. Think about what that actually means. 18,000 men, many sick, many starving, ordered to cross a flooded monsoon river on bamboo rafts without firing a shot or calling for help. And the army waiting on the far bank now knew every detail of how, when, and where they would try. Messervy used those 2 weeks. He reinforced the critical sector where the captured plan showed one of the main routes ran directly through his lines, moving in fresh brigades to thicken the position. Artillery was ranged in on the crossing points, every one of them, until the gunners could drop shells onto ground they would never even see the enemy reach. The Royal Air Force organized standing patrols of Spitfires and Thunderbolts, ready to be called down by ground controllers embedded with the forward units. Forward observation officers, on the ground and in the air, were positioned to direct fire in real time. The trap was set. All the British had to do was wait. The Japanese diversionary attack went in on the 3rd of July, and this is where the whole operation began to fall apart before the breakout even started. The attack was mistimed. It came a full week before the 28th Army was ready to move. Instead of pulling British forces away from the crossing routes, it did the opposite. It confirmed everything the captured documents had described, and it handed the British even more time to prepare. The diversion could barely muster the strength of a single brigade. The British let it advance into exposed ground along the bend, and then opened up with everything. Artillery hammered the Japanese positions. Forward observers tracked every movement and adjusted fire in real time. Overhead, RAF patrols directed fighter bombers onto target after target. By the 7th of July, the country around the bend was under chest-high water, and both sides were fighting in conditions that made ordinary infantry movement almost impossible. But the Japanese took far the worse of it. The diversion accomplished nothing except getting men killed. The British had watched it unfold exactly as the papers said it would, and now they turned their full attention north, to the real breakout sector. On the 15th of July, the 28th Army finally began moving out of the Pegu Yomas. Still with no idea the British held their entire plan. The monsoon was at full force. The paddy fields between the mountains and the river were flooded waist-deep in places, chest-deep in others. Visibility was minimal, and the men wading through that water were in a terrible state, some so weakened they had to be propped up by the soldiers on either side. The British had built 2 killing zones. The first was fixed on the crossing points along the main road the Japanese had to reach before the river, every point pre-ranged by the guns. The second was the open stretch between the road and the Sittang itself, worked over by aircraft that could fly even in poor monsoon weather. And beyond the river, on the eastern bank, Burmese fighters and Karen guerrillas waited for anyone who made it that far. There was no battle in the ordinary sense. The Japanese columns ran into division-strength strongpoints backed by tanks, and every attack was thrown back with enormous loss. Forward observers on the far bank kept calling artillery down onto survivors as they tried to reform. The RAF attacked everything that moved: troop concentrations, bamboo rafts, river craft of any kind. Spitfires and Thunderbolts worked in relays, directed by ground controllers sometimes so close to the action they were wounded by fragments of their own bombs. One flight lieutenant and a corporal directed the best part of 17 aircraft at a time onto targets barely 200 yards from their own position, and both were hit by splinters from the very fighter bombers they were guiding in. That is how close this fighting was. The soldiers who fought it called it a gunner's war, and that phrase tells you almost everything about its character. The Japanese were caught in the open, in flooded ground, with no cover, no fire support, and no way to call for help, and the artillery simply destroyed them. By the 21st of July, the Japanese launched their last and most desperate attempt to cross. The remaining 10,000 or so, Many of them ravaged by cholera and dysentery, stepped out of the Pegu Yomas and pushed across the drowned fields toward the river. Every available Allied tank, gun, mortar, and machine gun opened on them. Despite low cloud and heavy rain, every aircraft that could fly went up. Thunderbolts carrying 3 heavy bombs apiece and Spitfires with one each dropped them straight into columns of moving men who had no way to shoot back. And those who somehow made it past the guns and the aircraft still had the Sittang itself to cross, swollen to many times its dry season width, running fast and brown with monsoon water. The bamboo rafts were barely seaworthy in calm conditions. In that current they came apart, and men already hollowed out by starvation and disease had nothing left to fight the river with. Hundreds simply drowned. By the end of July, the breakout was over, and the Karen guerrillas in the hills east of the Sittang, armed and coordinated through the British Special Operations Network known as Force 136, ambushed hundreds more of the survivors. When it was done, the numbers told a story that is almost hard to believe. Of the 18,000 men under the 28th Army, fewer than 6,000 reached the eastern bank. The 54th Division lost more than 5,000. The 55th Division, which had started with some 9,000, brought fewer than 4,000 out. The Naval Guard force was effectively wiped out. Total Japanese casualties came to around 14,000, with more than 8,000 killed. Around 700 were taken prisoner, and most of those only because they were physically incapable of going on. Even the British commanders acknowledged the courage of the Japanese soldier, noting that the prisoners were usually men who simply could not move another step. On the British side, the losses were almost impossibly low, around 96 men killed and a few hundred wounded, and some of even those from friendly fire. Out of an engagement that sprawled across more than 100 miles of front and involved tens of thousands of men, the defenders lost fewer than 100 dead. The Royal Air Force flew over 3,000 sorties and dropped roughly 750 tons of bombs. Air power and artillery caused the overwhelming majority of the Japanese dead. This was not a battle settled by infantry charges or hand-to-hand fighting. It was settled by firepower, applied with precision, onto an enemy that could not hide, could not shoot back, and could not escape. And then the war ended. Japan surrendered on the 15th of August, 1945. But for the Japanese remnants east of the Sittang, the end of the war made things worse, not better. Desperate to reach the Tenasserim Hills and refusing to be caught on the wrong side of the river, another 2,000 of them died after the fighting was officially over, killed in the first days of what was supposed to be peace by guerrillas, by disease, or by the river itself. In September, the last units of what had once been the mighty Japanese Burma Area Army laid down their arms. The force that had conquered an entire country in 1942, that had driven the British Empire out of Southeast Asia and held it for 3 years, had been systematically taken apart by an army that had rebuilt itself from nothing. And the last act of that destruction happened at a bend in a river that most people have never heard of. The Battle of the Sittang Bend is one of those events swallowed by everything around it. Hiroshima and Nagasaki came 2 weeks later. The formal surrender on the deck of the Missouri came 6 weeks after that. In the story of how the Second World War ended, a brutal artillery and infantry battle in the monsoon mud of Burma barely rates a footnote. The men who fought it were the forgotten army, and this was their forgotten victory. But look at what actually happened here. A starving army of 18,000 was given one chance to escape, and the British turned that chance into a slaughter so complete it ended the war in Burma before the atomic bombs ended it everywhere else. And here is the part that stays with me. The thing that decided it was not a weapon or a grand plan. It was a leather bag found by chance on a dead man in the mud by a patrol that had no idea what it had. Without those documents, the breakout would probably still have failed. But with them, the British placed their firepower like a scalpel and turned what could have been a messy, weeks-long pursuit into a concentrated killing that was essentially over in a fortnight. The most dangerous weapon in war is rarely the sharpest blade or the largest army. Sometimes it is simply knowing, before your enemy does, exactly what he is about to do. The Japanese at the Sittang were sick, starving, abandoned men, ordered to cross a river they could not manage. On rafts they built from bamboo, without firing their weapons, against an enemy who already knew their every move, and they went anyway. Their own commander's plan had been read like an open book, and they never even knew it. There is one last detail that ties the whole Burma campaign together. In 1942, during the original Japanese invasion, the British had blown the bridge over this same Sittang to slow the enemy, and the explosion trapped their own division on the wrong bank, where the men lost everything swimming across. It was one of the most bitter decisions of the entire retreat. 3 years later, it was the Japanese who were trapped by the same river, trying to cross in the opposite direction, dying in the same water that had swallowed British equipment in 1942. The Sittang took from both sides. It just took far more from one. Now you know the story. If you learned something, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if you think the Burma campaign deserves a lot more attention than it gets, and leave a comment telling me which forgotten battle you want me to cover next. I read every one.